Great. Welcome, everyone. We see people trickling in, so we'll just give a few seconds as people get situated, but welcome to this event. As you're coming in, if you would like to introduce yourself with your name and your organization in the chat box, you're welcome to do so. I also encourage our speakers to start to get the ball rolling. Right, great. We're going to begin as people come in. Welcome. This event is called Corporate Investments in ESG, Adjacencies to the International Development Ecosystem, and is hosted by the Corporate Role and Development Workgroup. My name is Malvika Randive. I'm a program coordinator at SID United States, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this event today. A little about SID United States, if you're not familiar with us, we are the largest and the most active chapter of the Society for International Development, which is an international network founded in 1957 to serve as a global forum dedicated to sustainable economic, social, and political development. We serve as a global town square for the international development community, bringing together people from diverse organizations, disciplines, and career stages in a neutral, independent forum to share information and discuss important issues and challenges facing our community today. A few ways that you can get involved with us. You can check out some of our upcoming events and sign up for a weekly newsletter on our website, www.sid-us.org. You can also apply to be an intern or volunteer co-chair, and stay tuned for other volunteer opportunities that we always have coming up. Follow us on social media to stay in touch with all of our activities and see what we're up to. A few things to note for today's session. This session is recorded and it will be shared publicly through our networks and social media channels. Everyone registered for this event will also have access to the recording and a summary after. Live transcription closed captioning is available, and it can be activated through your personal individual settings on Zoom. If you have any questions for our speakers, please make sure to post them in the Q&A box. We have a chat box and a Q&A box, and we're going to take questions coming in from Q&A specifically. If you have any questions for a specific speaker, please make sure you note that until we can make sure to get the question to them. We may not be able to answer all questions due to limited time. Our corporate role and development co-chairs are Olamide Melekpe and Lisa Marie Monsanto. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator and our former co-chair for the corporate role and development work group, Mike Ingram.
Thanks, Malvika. Welcome everybody to this event of the Corporate Role and Development Working Group entitled Corporate Investments in ESG, Adjacencies to the International Development Sector. My name is Mike Ingram. I'm a senior manager in Accenture Development Partnerships, which is Accenture's social impact consultancy that's been supporting the international impact sector for about 20 years. As Malvika mentioned, I'm the outgoing co-chair of the working group, and I'm your moderator for today. We originally conceived of this discussion, given demand from the working group, is there was a lot of interest in better understanding the trends in the commercial sector around ESG and how they were increasingly bumping up against the international development ecosystem. We know that commercial actors are increasingly focusing on ESG, not just because of the social impact, but because of the direct demand from their consumers, employees, shareholders, and regulators for behavioral change. This new market demand for something other than pure bottom line profitability is changing behaviors throughout the commercial world. Increasingly, this is bringing commercial actors closer to the social impact aspects of the international development sector. We brought together this esteemed panel to share with us a bit about their experience and perspective in this rich topic. So let me introduce our panel. First, we have Kathy Ruskowski, Senior Director for Global Sustainability at McCormick. She is responsible for leading the development of McCormick's long-term results-oriented sustainability strategy that elevates purpose-led performance. Purpose-led performance is McCormick's ongoing commitment to delivering top-tier financial performance while doing what's right for people, the communities where we live, work, and source, and the planet we all share. Prior to joining McCormick, Dr. Ruskowski served for over 8 years at USAID, focused on private sector engagement. Next, we have Ben Crampton. Ben is the Director for European Government Affairs at Microsoft. He joined the company recently in 2021 after 20 years as a diplomat working for the UK Foreign Office, the UN, and principally the EU. His work as a diplomat focused primarily on conflict, post-conflict negotiation in the Balkans, Caucasus, and East Africa. His last position before joining Microsoft was as Chief of Staff to the EU Special Representative for the Horn of Africa. Ben is also a member of the board of Finchurch Aid Investments, a nonprofit investment fund based in Helsinki and investing in SMEs in Kenya, Somalia, and Uganda. And lastly, we have Jennifer Billings, the Global Agriculture Development Leader for Corteva AgriScience. As a leader of innovative sustainable solutions for farmers worldwide, Corteva is committed to enriching the lives of those who produce and those who consume for generations to come. At Corteva, Jennifer leads a portfolio of strategic collaborations for agricultural development stakeholders to advance global food security. Prior to her time at Corteva, Ms. Billings worked in a variety of positions at USAID and the Department of State focused on agriculture, food security, and private sector partnerships. Our agenda for the rest of this event is first to allow each of our panelists to give a short presentation to share a bit about what's going on within their institutions around the topic of ESG. Then I will moderate a discussion around the topic with some curated questions, and then we'll have an open Q&A for those participants who have questions for our panelists. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our first presenter, Kathy, to get us started. Kathy, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. I'm just going to share my screen. And it looks like that's working. So thank you, Mike and Sid, for having me today. I think this is a really interesting topic, and I'm happy to share with you a little bit about McCormick's environmental, social, and governance strategy at the start. So first of all, just a little bit of background on McCormick. McCormick is a global leader in flavor. We operate in two segments. So we have consumer as well as flavor solutions, providing flavor as well as healthy choices across the globe. Our consumer segment has leading brand shares in our key categories in many markets around the world. We have brands in nearly 170 countries and territories and sell products at every price point, ranging from premium brands to private label. Our flavor solutions segment is a culinary-inspired flavor business with a deep understanding of consumer flavor experiences created from real food and natural ingredients. And it's underpinned by leading technology that develops consumer-preferred flavor solutions for our customers. The breadth and reach of our global flavor portfolio positions us to fully meet the growing demand for flavor around the world and drive continued differentiated growth. Part of that differentiation for McCormick is purpose. McCormick has a proud legacy of doing what's right for people, communities, and the planet. Our purpose-led performance principle is an expression of that legacy, and it's our ongoing commitment to deliver top-tier financial results while doing what's right. The cornerstone of McCormick's approach is helping people live better lives. We champion equality and are committed to education, development, and the well-being of our employees while working to create better health outcomes. The communities where we live, work, and source are the bedrock of our operational success. We're dedicated to improving lives across our supply chain, in farming communities, and in the communities we serve. And we're also committed to lessening the effects of climate change by adhering to science-based targets that help reduce our carbon emissions, energy consumption, waste, and water use. Our commitment to ESG is embedded in our overall business strategy, and we continue to be recognized by various ESG raters and rankers. Most recently, we were recognized by Corporate Knights in their Global 100 Most Sustainable Corporations Index as the #1 most sustainable corporation in food products for the 7th year in a row. So just to give you a little bit more detail on the goals that we have around our ESG strategy, our purpose-led performance goals are a set of strategic and time-bound goals that span those pillars of people, communities, and planet. And I'll zoom in on a few that are most relevant to international development. So we want to sustainably source 100% of herbs and spices in our portfolio, beginning with our top 5 branded iconics. We also aim to increase the resilience of 90% of smallholder farmers who grow those iconic herbs and spices. And as part of that commitment, we're also reducing our Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions because the bulk of our emissions are within our supply chain. To underscore that commitment, McCormick has created the Grown for Good framework. It's the first of its kind standard that includes metrics that drive community resilience, including economic stability for farmers, gender equality, and women's empowerment, as well as biodiversity conservation and regenerative agriculture processes. Here's the framework for Grown for Good, and it's a holistic sustainability approach across our supply chain. It was designed to impact 3 key areas: ethical and safe supply chains, regenerative production systems, and resilient communities. In addition to meeting the environmental standards around water, waste, and biodiversity and traceability, McCormick's Grown for Good sustainability standard goes above and beyond the criteria set by other farm-level standards and certifications to take a holistic approach. This farm-to-facility program includes additional requirements to increase resilience and empower women in the communities from which we source raw materials. And like I said before, we're beginning with our top 5 branded ingredients. So that's black pepper, red pepper, vanilla, oregano, and cinnamon, and have a vision to source 100% of our herbs and spice portfolio. We source over 15,000 raw materials from around 80 countries. And so increasing the resilience of our smallholder farmers improves their livelihoods, but it also makes good business sense. For those in international development, in the SID audience, I'm sure you can recognize that this structure is not unlike a results framework that you might commonly work with, both in structure and in the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. It's in this area of work where there are the strong adjacencies to international development, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Great, thank you so much, Kathy. We'll hand it over to Ben to talk a little bit about what Microsoft is up to.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you very much to Sid for the invitation here. I'm going to share my screen now, I hope. Can you see that, Mike? Yep, good. So I will start with, if you don't mind, a slightly self-indulgent photo, which was actually taken on my wedding day, which you can probably tell wasn't particularly long ago. Mike introduced me as having joined Microsoft relatively recently, and that's correct. I'm based in Brussels. I work on European government affairs, which is the interface with the European Union and the member states of the European Union and NATO. But until quite recently, I was working as a diplomat mainly in conflict areas, and until recently in East Africa, and I maintain a connection to there, as Mike made clear. What I should say, though, of course, is I don't work for the philanthropies or the ESG side of the company. So I do forgive me if I give only a slightly sketchy outline of what we do, but hopefully I can go into a bit more depth when we have a Q&A at the end. Microsoft has the following mission, which is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. Now, if you have a mission that is as ambitious and as far-reaching as that, and of course, you know, every person, every organization, that naturally means that that engagement with developing countries, engagement with the global South, is a part of our business as much as anything else. So to that extent, ESG and engagement with what would in many cases be considered development funding scenarios are a normal part of our activities. But they are also handled by parts of the company with specific responsibility for this, and that includes Microsoft Philanthropies, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Now, again, if you're a company the size of Microsoft with a hugely ambitious mission, then naturally the ESG requirements of the company are very far-reaching as well. They're broken down for our purposes into 4 areas, which is earning trust, creating a sustainable future, supporting inclusive economic growth, and protecting fundamental rights. Now, naturally, many of these overlap, and you'll see some of those overlaps very shortly in a couple of examples that I want to give about what we're doing in this area. But I also want to focus in, as Kathy did, on those that are particularly relevant to the development community. So I'll focus in on those shortly, but I will quickly cover our sustainability goals, which are extremely ambitious. And that is to be carbon negative by 2030, and to have removed from the atmosphere by 2050 all of the emissions that the company has put out from its foundation in 1980. Now, that means investment in carbon capture and storage, apart from anything else. And that's something I'd be happy to talk about a little bit. We're looking at zero waste by 2030. I should add, by the way, just as Kathy did, that we in our reporting are very keen to ensure that we cover the full scope 1, 2, and 3 of our emissions. And just as is the case with McCormick, many of our emissions are from our supply chains. So zero waste by 2030 in our direct waste footprint, and 2030 again being the target for replenishing more water than we use, and 2025 the target to protect more land than we use, and to build a planetary computer. Now, the planetary computer I will talk about just very briefly. This is essentially an open access network of information systems so that NGOs, the nonprofit sector, academia can work on climate-related and conservation-related issues using open source and open data systems. I would also add that I think the land use and water use targets are particularly important, particularly when you look at the rollout of AI by Microsoft and other companies. This is going to involve a great deal more energy use, a great deal more requirement for cooling. So to have these targets is not about what the technology and what the land use and water use and energy use are now. It's what we anticipate them to be in a few years' time, which is greater than it is now. So those targets are also growing in ambition at the same time. On inclusive economic growth and fundamental rights, I'll just cover a few things here. So these include, the commitments we have here include the provision of digital skills and opportunity. We include digital skilling in almost all of our activities, and that is it's a global commitment. So for instance, in December last year, we made a new announcement on rolling out cybersecurity skilling programs in Africa via LinkedIn and other programs. And that's because as Africa grows in terms of its digital engagement, digital transformation, its cybersecurity issues will also grow. So cybersecurity skilling is a global problem. It's a huge problem in North America and Western Europe. It's an even bigger problem in the global South. So cybersecurity skilling is a big commitment of ours in that area. Similarly, when it comes to data, I mentioned the planetary computer. We're keen to promote open data, particularly in the climate and environmental sphere, so that academia and nonprofits have access to data sets that are important for monitoring the effects of climate change, the progress in terms of reduction of emissions. And this includes things like an open data set to monitor utility scale renewables globally, and another open data set to monitor the health of glaciers in the Hindu Kush. Just two examples. And that's a classic example of one ESG requirement overlapping with another, namely sustainability. On fundamental rights and humanitarian action, we have a whole responsible AI for disaster response. So AI for, let me just get the name right here. AI for humanitarian action, and that's in partnership with several nonprofits, including Médecins Sans Frontières, but also UNHCR. We have large-scale skilling and digital skilling for displaced persons. There's a fantastic video if you go onto our website of a major skilling program in the refugee camp at Kakuma in northwestern Kenya, which I visited in a former life because it's for displaced people from South Sudan, which is one of the conflicts I used to work on. And there's also a fascinating one called AI for Cultural Heritage, which includes AI programs to assist in the preservation of threatened languages. And finally, we've got Safeguarding Democracy as a program here. This is including support for journalism. This includes, for instance, account guard for journalists who are under threat in various places, but it also includes major programs on disinformation and media literacy. Now, a couple of quick ones that I think are particularly relevant here. I just wanted to talk about tech for social impact. I think I've seen a list of potential participants in this thing. I think a lot of people, a lot of organizations who are represented here will actually be benefiting from tech for social impact. This is a program for international organizations and nonprofits, which essentially provides cutting edge cloud technology and software solutions for nonprofits and international organizations. And the offering is varied according to the scale of that nonprofit. I've been working with TSI, as we call it, to try and get this extended to our investments in East Africa. So this is a subject close to my heart. But at the recent LDC 5 meeting in Qatar, we also made a commitment to now roll out TSI at a more nation-state level to assist least developed countries in achieving their digital transition ambitions. And that's something that will be rolled out as part of the 10-year program of the LDC international meetings. The next one is in 2033. So there's a long time frame on this, but the figures you'll see here indicate the scale of the problem. We're talking about average internet speeds in these developed countries that are 8 times lower than they are in developed countries, that there are only 20% of people in LDCs that have access to broadband internet as opposed to 90% in developed countries, and 23% of the population in LDCs that have no access at all to broadband or mobile. So I will talk in a minute about airband, which is one of the solutions to that, but just to round off on this, the idea behind TSI then is that we will partner with nonprofits, but also with governments and international organizations to try and bridge that digital divide, to work with both to increase access to the internet and literacy and skilling, to increase access to the internet, with the aim, of course, of ensuring that you have economies in these countries that ultimately are self-sustaining in terms of their digital uptake and become growing markets for companies like Microsoft as well. Here's a further slide on digital for development. It talks about the various different components and the various different partners we look at. But I can answer more questions on this in the Q&A if useful, because I'm using too much time. Finally, airband. Airband is a fascinating project which we're rolling out in Africa at a large scale now. It originated in the US because there was we noted in Microsoft that there were surprisingly large numbers of areas in the US that still had very weak access to broadband internet. So the question was, how do you reach that last mile? How do you reach these isolated communities? And the solution is this airband initiative, which is technology neutral. In some cases, we use an extension of the broadband network through fiber cabling. In some cases, we use extended Wi-Fi systems. In some cases, we piggyback on the phone network. One of the more interesting ones is that we often, in America at least, have used TV white spaces. These are unused TV broadcasting frequencies. Now, globally, we're looking more at satellite and extension of Wi-Fi networks, but the intention under the airband initiative is to extend airband to 250 million people globally by 2025, and including 100 million in Africa. We do this through local partners. So those of you who've worked in Africa may have come across M-Kopa or Mawingu, I think it is, in Kenya, or Bluetown in Ghana and Mozambique. But in these cases, what we're doing is working with local partners. They will identify the best solution, the most cost-effective solution, because this access has to be market friendly. It has to be cheap, and in many cases, our airband offerings are actually cheaper than 4G data on mobile networks, which of course is the favored mechanism of getting data access in much of Africa. So airband is a fascinating area. We work very closely with USAID on several of these projects. So I know many of the participants today may be familiar with this one, but we're hoping to work with other partners as well. And part of my work is to work with the European Union in their development funding mechanisms and investment banks here to try and get airband taken up by them as well and applied more in Africa, but also more globally in the rest of the world. So that's a quick overview. Over.
Yeah, thanks so much. Fascinating stuff. I'll hand it over to Jennifer, and I think she's got a video that Malavika is going to bring up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really exciting to be here for this conversation. Nice to see so many familiar faces on the registration list. And thank you again to SID for bringing us all together. Like Microsoft and McCormick, we are also very committed to positively impacting communities and the planet around the globe. And I actually think that the way that we do that best and where we have the most impact is through our innovations and technologies, and the impact that is having on farmers, on productivity, on yields and incomes, and on empowering farmers to be able to adapt to various climatic conditions, as well as the increasing threats of pests, diseases, weeds, et cetera. We also have strong commitments on the ESG side related to our sustainable innovations, related to greenhouse gas emissions, ID&E, and biodiversity, as well as philanthropic efforts across the globe that are focused on empowering women, communities, and youth. And then we have the work that I lead here at Corteva, which is related to collaborating with the public sector in order to improve the productivity and incomes of farmers globally. And we collaborate with many of you on the line, and we absolutely couldn't do this work without all of you. So thank you again for being here. I thought best, a picture say 1,000 words. So best to share a video of one of those collaborations to highlight some of the incredible work that we've done together. So Malavika, if you could please bring that up. Thank you.
Now, Malavika, we're not getting the sound currently.
Maybe if you unmute, that'll be good.
Hapa kwenye kijiji changu tunaishi na wakulima. Wakati nilipokuwa ninasoma mimi, pamoja na kusema na mimi ni maisha ya China ambayo ninayo, mimi nilimaliza shule sijawahi kuvaa kiatu. Sikuweza kutayarishiwa chai. Yaani ninamshukuru sana Mungu. Kwa hiyo mabadiliko ni makubwa sana. Kipindi cha nyuma katika eka moja nilikuwa napata 700, lakini toka nilivyopata haya mafunzo ninatumia mbegu bora, ninapata gunia 23 mpaka 25.
Sisi kama Corteva Tanzania tunashirikiana na wanashirika kama USAID. Mafunzo tunayowapa wakulima yanawasaidia sana kutoka kwenye kilimo kidogo mpaka kufikia kwenye uzalishaji mkubwa.
We estimate that roughly 60% of Tanzanians in one way or another are engaged in agriculture. Imagine where we have a champion like Queen inspiring her peer farmers, the effect that can have on these 600,000 farmers that we target.
Mkulima mmoja akikuza uchumi wake ni taifa nzima au ni nchi yote sasa uchumi wake umekuwa. Kwangu mimi nasikia fahari sana kwa sababu kimeleta mabadiliko makubwa sana ambayo ni jamii yangu ambayo mimi nimekulia.
When we partner Corteva resources with those of USAID, with public investment of Tanzania, these are fundamental ingredients to self-reliance.
Toka hii project imeanza, mabadiliko ni makubwa sana. Kipato ninachopata inanisaidia kwa elimu ya watoto. Ninaona kwa kweli watoto wangu wataishi maisha mazuri sana.
Thank you, Malavika. So what I love about that video is it really shows the passion of my colleagues in Tanzania, of USAID staff and partner staff in Tanzania. And I think, it shows the impact that we can have together and the different roles that we play within those collaborations. So Corteva brings technologies and agronomic support and supply chains and other things to the table. But the partners in that program, SID-US and USAID, brought lots of their own strengths of, credit, access to credit, access to markets, post-harvest solutions, things that Corteva is not, our strengths. So, and not what we focus on. And together we were able to really lift up whole communities to build and the capacity of market systems in a very sustainable market-led way. And, in Tanzania, we have a strong business footprint and we are committed to growing our business in that country. And I think that, that's just one country example, but you can see that we are having, I think, the greatest impact through our direct business model However, collaborations like this really allow us to expand our business, reduce risk, grow within markets, and be able to better serve farmers around the globe. So I just want to say thank you again for all of you who are here, and thank you for all the collaboration globally. We really value the impact and the shared value and goals that we're achieving together.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Hopefully you are all of the participants who are with us today were inspired by kind of what we've seen from the corporations represented by these three panelists. I know I was, and hopefully it's not lost on you that the selection of our panel was quite intentional in that each of them kind of originally hails from the development or diplomatic sector. And I think part of what I found interesting about that is in a lot of ways, it just demonstrates the value that the corporate sector has for kind of the social impact work that happens in the development sector, and that we think that that's increasing. So with no further ado, why don't we jump into the discussion? So as I said at the beginning, I'll start off by kind of moderating a discussion with the panelists around a series of curated questions, and then we will open it up for Q&A. So I would encourage each of you, if you have questions, I currently do not see anything in the Q&A. So as we're moving forward, I would encourage you to pop questions in the Q&A, and we will, subsequent to the moderated portion, start pulling questions directly from the Q&A. All right. So the first question I have is one for Kathy, and that is, how have you seen the dialogue around ESG evolve within your organization since taking on your role? And to what extent do you see demand manifesting now more from the business side of McCormick versus the foundation or CSR side, where maybe it would have historically arisen from?
Sure, thanks for that, Mike. And so in my intro, I described McCormick's purpose-led performance, and the first set of goals around purpose-led performance were set in 2017. So McCormick has been leading in terms of embedding these issues into business practices for some time. The philanthropic and charitable side is still a large part of purpose at McCormick. So we do have our Power of Giving umbrella, under which we activate employees around specific charity events. We also have a platform by which employees can donate to their charity of choice, which is matched by the company. But we operate to deliver our goals across purpose-led performance with a cross-functional team that has representation that fit in the functions where those goals are implemented. So, our sourcing goals around Grown for Good sit with our sustainable sourcing team within procurement. Our greenhouse gas emissions goals around our operations for scope 1 and 2 sit within our supply chain team. And so what I have found interesting in the time that I have been at McCormick, so we have already had that sort of embedded view of who's driving against those goals. But in the last 2 years or so, what I've noticed is that the demand for ESG performance is growing by all stakeholders. And so we are getting increasing questions from customers that are asking for much more detailed information on the products that they source from us. We're getting inquiries from investors with specific information, or asking for specific information around how we're implementing our various policies around ESG. And then the various ESG ratings and rankings organizations that are providing recognitions to companies around their sustainability leadership are really ratcheting up their scoring criteria. So it's no longer enough to have a commitment around an ESG issue. You really need to be disclosing that commitment, disclosing your progress on that commitment, and showing that you're being ambitious in that goal setting. Regulators too, across the globe, are starting to set reporting requirements, which has been interesting because addressing many ESG issues as part of corporate commitments is becoming table stakes. So rather than a differentiator for companies, some of these goals are really becoming a requirement to be actually able to do business. And publishing data on ESG performance is moving more so from voluntary, as it has been in the past, to show your leadership, to mandatory in the very near term. And so what I found interesting is that regulatory reporting component being really a driver of change in the industry.
That's fascinating. I think it's interesting because ultimately, what we're talking about is kind of a new market demand. It's not that this is kind of a purely philanthropic perspective. That this is what our customers demand. It's what our investors demand. It's what our suppliers, employees, et cetera. And so it's kind of, if you're not active in this space, it's going to hurt your bottom line. So it's fascinating to kind of hear that example. The next question that I have, maybe start with Ben, and then if others want to comment on this as well, is how is the current economic situation, looming recession or inflationary environment, dampen the enthusiasm, if at all, for ESG, in the moment? And I guess the question is somewhat motivated by kind of, I guess, the past perspective that this kind of ESG or social impact orientation would be viewed more as a cost for the company, and in some ways costs get dropped, when the market goes down. And so I'm curious how you've seen maybe any change, if at all, at Microsoft.
I mean, as you know, my time at Microsoft has been relatively short. But having said that, I joined at a time when what the economic situation is now was not expected. And I have to say, I haven't noticed any change. I have not noticed any dampening of enthusiasm. And I think the reason for that is, as you said, I mean, it's a variety of factors. One is the expectation of employees. There is still the expectation of employees of Microsoft. We have had cutbacks, it's been public. But there's still the expectation of employees that the company will strive to do good. Second is the ambition of the company in that sphere. If you have these highly ambitious endeavors, to empower every person and every organization on the planet, then you can't drop your commitments to extend internet access in Africa because it's an integral part of your business model. But I think the other point is that particularly when you talk about the LDCs in the markets there, I mean, I'm old enough, I think we probably both are, Mike, to remember the discussion at the beginning of my career about whether or not mobile telephony would offer the ability in Africa to leapfrog fixed line telephony. Well, now we're in a situation in which we're now talking about ensuring internet access for the global South in order to be able to compete globally in a new information environment. And I think that's an entirely realistic discussion to have. You have a highly youthful population, it's an increasingly skilled population in this part of the world. And so for a company, it's not a philanthropic endeavor to try and engage that population. It's a business endeavor.
I think it's a great point. And I think that's one of the things that I find so interesting, about honestly each of your presentations is it was clear that none of this is pure cost. And that this is about demand generation. This is about reducing risk in our supply chains. This is about strengthening a potential market. So in like I said, it's not just the cost side of the coin anymore. I don't know if Kathy or Jennifer, if either of you have thoughts from your side on this one.
I think just to add I think there's actually a high cost of inaction. And so as these requirements, from all stakeholders continue to rise, the rationale, for example, for requiring ESG reporting from a regulatory perspective is that ESG issues are material to a company's long-term value and business resilience. And so it's simply no longer optional for companies to be integrating these into their strategies.
Fantastic. The next question I have, maybe one that's current with us in the news, is around if you could share a little bit about what your organizations are doing in and around the crisis in Ukraine, and to what extent have you been coordinating with actors in the development sector? Maybe we could start first with Jennifer and then move over to Ben.
Thank you, Mike. I think everyone's aware of how important Ukrainian agriculture is to global grain production and global food security, and the impact that the conflict has had on Ukrainian agriculture. And at Corteva, we're very committed to supporting Ukrainian farmers during this challenging time, and to ensuring that they have access to the tools and technologies to be able to grow food for both their communities and the world. And so we are, yes, working closely with development partners such as USAID and the Development Finance Corporation to advance collaborations around access to critical inputs such as seeds and crop protection products, as well as innovative and financial tools that can allow farmers to continue to operate and run their businesses. We also are invested in Ukraine as a business, and we have committed with the announcement with the Ministry of Agriculture a few months ago to increasing seed production by 30% within Ukraine. And we are hoping to also increase imports of crop protection products by 10% over the next 5 years. So we absolutely want to work closely with our farmer customers. We have a direct model in Ukraine where we provide close support, agronomic support, and financial tools to our customers. And we want to continue to work very closely with those customers so they can operate and hopefully even grow their businesses in the coming years.
Thank you. Dan, any thoughts from the Microsoft perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for a very long time about this. I mean, Microsoft has, we put out a number of reports. In fact, I think I'll post the latest one, which was actually last week in the chat. I mean, on this one, we acted very quickly. The story has been told several times, but I mean, we actually spotted a major uptick in cyber attacks on Ukraine shortly before the actual invasion began. And worked very closely with the Ukrainian government at that point. I mean, it's worth pointing out that Ukraine, even prior to the full-scale invasion last year, was the second most attacked country in the world after the US in terms of nation-state directed cyber attacks. So the Ukrainians, I mean, had a great deal of experience, and we'd already been working with them quite closely. But I mean, what I think that the most important thing that we did in very early stages of the war was help the Ukrainian government move its data from on-premises servers, which were vulnerable to physical attack, into the public cloud so that their data was safe and could continue to be used. So I think in many respects, some of the resilience, I mean, the credit for the resilience that the Ukrainian population and government has showed goes to them entirely. But to the extent that we've been able to help, I mean, I think that was the single most important step that we made was to transfer that data to the cloud. And I think increasingly it's something we are now beginning to work with development agencies on. So we've been having discussions with investment banks about extending that kind of support also to the economic sector, the SME sector in particular, because many of the countries that are neighboring Russia, to a large extent, actually were using Russian software in a business context. Now, for obvious reasons, there's concern about that now. And, you know, there will be a long-term process of transferring to, if you like, Western technology and Western systems from a resilience and cybersecurity perspective, if for no other reason.
It's fascinating. You know, I in a lot of ways, I love the kind of the tight linkage, you know, both with Corteva and Microsoft about you know, what you're doing is your expertise. You're bringing your expertise and you're applying it, you know, as needed. And I think again, that's, you know, a commonality and you know, the push to ESG is you're not just granting outside of your competency, you're engaging with what you do best.
And I did forget to mention, Mike, that we, of course, have done a lot on the philanthropy side as well. We have given grants for food banks and other community support quite extensively. But, you know, I'm with you that I think our greatest impact is continuing to ensure access to our tools and technologies.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, and it's the same on this side. Of course, there's humanitarian elements as well. And we also assisted in mapping damage to schools and hospitals to assist in repair processes. But yeah, fundamentally, it comes down to the ability to deliver technology that is our core competence, but also the best support we can provide.
Fantastic. The next question I have really gets to, maybe one of the stickier questions within the ESG, the evolving ESG conversation, which is one around measurement. And I guess I'd be interested, if you would, share a little bit about how your organizations incorporate maybe a shared value mindset, kind of that blend between the business side and the social impact side in the way that you measure your success around ESG. For this one, maybe we'll start with Kathy, then move over to Jennifer.
Thanks, Mike. So I would say that in terms of incorporating a shared value mindset, we start with how we develop our strategy in ESG. And so like many other companies, we use a materiality assessment to help us identify the sustainability issues that may have the most impact on the business or that the business may have the most impact on. So in other words, the space in which the business and the environmental or social value meet. Our materiality assessment has driven forward our approach to sustainability, and it allows us to prioritize topics that are most important to our business and our external stakeholders. And in creating that, in doing that assessment, we included customers, consumers, employees, communities, and shareholders. Our most recent materiality assessment included, we intentionally included employees that worked on sustainability as part of their day-to-day job, as well as those that typically do not, to ensure that we brought out their view of the company's direction. And in terms of external stakeholders, we interviewed and surveyed international governmental organizations, as well as non-governmental organizations, trade bodies, investors, industry analysts, as well as suppliers, and surveyed over 1,000 consumers. And so in the end, what we have is a materiality matrix, which shows on one axis the internal stakeholder importance of a specific ESG issue, and on the other axis, the external importance. And it's kind of mapped, and you can see, as you move up into the right corner, what is of high importance to both types of stakeholders. And those become our top material ESG issues that we need to prioritize. We intentionally publish that, as many companies do, in our external reporting, so that you can see the importance of those to our plans. And then our strategy around purpose-led performance sets goals around the most material ESG issues. And then we measure and report on our progress against those goals over time. What's interesting about the measurement piece that you focused on is, I already mentioned that the ESG reporting regulatory environment is evolving and growing quite rapidly. There are a number of ESG standard frameworks that corporates are currently voluntarily reporting on, and in the future may be required to report on. And so a part of our measuring, a part of our goal setting, as well as our approach to measurement, has been to ensure that the way that we measure our goals is aligned with best practice standards. So we look across those frameworks to identify how we can best measure against those top ESG issues that we've identified as most material, and how that applies to standard frameworks that are preferred by our investors and our other stakeholders.
Jennifer, thoughts from a Corteva side?
So we also, like McCormick, have extensive measurements of our sustainability goals and other ESG related data. But one thing that I wanted to mention is that we really value the M&E that USAID brings to the table and other donor partners, and the M&E that's then done by the implementing partners under the USAID programs, because those kind of measurements, the indicators around income increases and productivity yield increases, are really valuable to show the full social impact of our collaborations. And those are not the kind of, that is not the kind of M&E that Corteva has the capacity or is in the business of doing. And so, obviously we're on our side calculating the business value to us, but the social impact value in a very methodical and well-vetted way to be able to have access to that data through our collaborations with USAID and other donors is incredibly valuable.
Something else that was interesting is just I noticed in at least 2 of the 3 presentations was also a deliberate linkage to the SDG framework, which obviously is kind of a development or diplomatic sector framework. And I think the fact that, you know, unprompted, you know, that the corporates are anchoring to that framework is again indicative of the influence that the developments in diplomatic sector are having on the trends in the commercial space around ESG. So just something that I think is interesting to observe. The next question that I have is maybe less about your organization and more about your individual observations. As I mentioned at the beginning, you know, the selection of the panel was intentional in that each of you kind of come from the development or diplomatic sector. And so I'd be curious if each of you would reflect on how your time in the private sector, even if it is brief, has reshaped maybe how you think about private sector engagement in the role in the development space. And so maybe for this one, we'll let Ben kick it off and then go Jennifer, then Kathy.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question. It's another one I could talk for a long time about. I think I will restrict myself to 2 observations. The first is, I think that when I was on the other side of the fence, as it were, when I was working on East Africa and the development world, then you operate in a highly complex environment. There are lots of different actors. There are lots of different agencies. You're dealing with governments. You're dealing with NGOs. You're dealing with individuals within your own structure. But it's exactly the same on the other side of the fence. I mean, if you're working for a large company, it's also highly structured. It's also highly siloed in some respects. And so it can take a little while, if you are on the outside, to find out who you need to talk to find out if you are, for instance, interested in talking about tech for social impact. It may not be obvious how you get to the information that you need. So I think, you know, all I can say is if you are in that position and you're listening to this discussion and you want to drop me a line, please do, because I can try and help find the person that you need to. It's not always easy, and I understand that. I think the second thing, though, is more fundamental. I think one of the issues that we have as we work in these sectors, I mean, I think particularly out of Africa, but that's simply because it's the environment that I'm most familiar with. We draw quite a strong distinction between philanthropy or development assistance and business. But ultimately, the aim of development assistance is to create societies in which businesses can thrive so that people can be prosperous. It's about creating prosperous societies. So if you're working with private sector, the private sector's motivation will be to do good. It is the intention to have a positive social impact, because we're normal people. We want the same things, and we want to have a positive impact. But the desire of the company is also to make money. Those 2 things are entirely compatible with each other. It is not a bad thing if, and again, I come at this from what I used to think in my old position. It's entirely compatible that we work together on a development assistance framework in a situation in which the intention of the company over time is to create a market for itself. These are good things. They will have a positive social impact. But it does require something of a philosophical change from those who work in the development sector, in my view, and for those who work in the business sector. There's a meeting of minds that's required, and I think it is working more than it used to. There's less of a strong division than there was, but there's still a bridge that needs to be built to over the gap.
Fantastic. Jennifer and Kathy.
So I've been at Corteva for 5 years now, and I came from 15 years working in the public sector and living overseas in many countries. And I remember early on in my career, I was working for USAID in Nepal, and I attended a training a regional training in Bangkok around private sector engagement. And someone put up a slide showing a graph of foreign direct investment versus development assistance over the decades. And basically it ended up being an inverse graph of, development assistance has gone down drastically over the decades, and foreign direct investment in emerging country economies has gone up. And really it's, in the long run, FDI that's going to move the needle and develop the economies of countries around the globe in a much greater way and much more rapid way than development assistance ever could. And it was that slide that kind of lit the fire for me and my passion for the rest of my career to want to engage the private sector in development. And I feel like, honestly, I'm just sitting at a different seat at the same table these days. That we, when I was with USAID, I worked on a lot of efforts to bring the private sector to the table when I was with state and other organizations. And now at Corteva, I am, just trying to continue to build those bridges and do the smartest efforts possible so we can have the greatest impact collectively, because ultimately the resources of all of us are limited and these challenges are not being solved. Global food insecurity is not in a good place. So the more that we can be collaborating all together to solve these challenges in the smartest and most sustainable market-driven ways, like Ben was saying, business thriving is a good thing. Stable, prosperous economies are a good thing. The better off we all are. So,
fantastic. Kathy, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, and I completely agree with what Ben and Jennifer were already saying. I think we're all trying to move towards the same common goal. In reflecting on the difference between my experience at USAID and my experience in a corporate, I often think about, at USAID, we focused a lot on the Venn diagram that shows the overlap. One circle is development goals and the other circle is private sector interests. And I think that we spend a lot of time finding the overlap, but only think about maybe that overlap being quite narrow when the overlap is actually much larger. And I think it's a really important starting point for goal alignment to identify maybe the few pieces where there's exact alignment on shared goals. And it's important to identify significant collaboration opportunity. But I think in the most effective collaborations where we're all trying to achieve the greater good as has been described here, I think we should spend more time understanding the full circles for both of those actors, because I think there is more overlapping than we're recognizing, and the non-overlapping parts still exist, but they are important to understand to better build a shared understanding. And I think that includes addressing some of the usual suspects of translating jargon from international development lingo to corporate lingo, so using the same language as well as breaking down each other's organizations' goal frameworks. But I think understanding context and revisiting that for each partner over time in a collaboration can lead to more effective and impactful work.
No, it's very interesting. I mean, one of the things that I do a lot of work kind of talking with NGOs about strategy, and private sector engagement is something that often comes up. And one of the things that I often talk about that, Kathy, your point kind of made me think about is a need to move beyond kind of a transactional mindset and to move to a relational mindset. And that if you're thinking about every connect with a corporate as like, where is this going to end from a grant perspective or from a specific project perspective, you're never going to build the relationships and understanding of the organization that you're partnering with to potentially see beyond the current transaction and actually see the potential for collaboration, which may only develop 2 to 3 years down the road once you have more of a sense of trust and that there's kind of a conducive environment. But I think the challenge is that for a lot of, especially NGOs, there is kind of a need to, just from an existential perspective, to see revenue coming in. And so the ability to actually think long-term, 2 to 3 years down the road, sometimes is impaired, or that there are barriers there just from internal incentives. But I think that's one of those things that, honestly, having folks like yourself kind of, moving from the development side to the corporate side, maybe has the opportunity to accelerate some of that. I see that we've now gotten at least one other question came in on the chat. I would encourage you, I only have about 3 questions left, so we're going to have about 30 minutes of open Q&A time, so please do put your questions in the Q&A. That's where we'll pull from, so please populate that. The next question that I have, kind of a follow on, again, you've all spent time in the development side and in the or diplomatic side, and your hiring in many ways is demonstrative of the demand for the knowledge and the competencies and experience that you bring. But I'd be interested if you could speak to maybe the differential value that experience has kind of brought to your organizations, the insight around the development space or the diplomatic space, and maybe why that's difficult for some of these organizations maybe to cultivate internally versus hiring externally. Maybe start with Kathy and we kind of go around the horn.
Yeah, sure. So I think that Jennifer already mentioned one, which is M&E. So just the monitoring skill set that sits within USAID and the international development community that supports USAID is just tremendous. And the thought leadership that is there in terms of understanding and measuring outcomes and impact, I think is far beyond where most private sector actors are today. And so I think that is a major skill set that international development and diplomacy professionals have. And I think paired with that is the project or program management. In international development, because of the various bureaucratic requirements, funding requirements, country requirements, individuals are managing large scale and complex programs that have strict requirements behind them, both in terms of how they're managing budget, how they're allocating budget, how they're tracking the outcomes associated with each piece of the work. And I think that there is a skill that is honed in those organizations that is just at another level than project and program management that perhaps happens elsewhere. And then, of course, I spoke at the beginning about how we are doing work deep in our supply chains that is very adjacent to international development work when it comes to ESG commitments. I've shared our Grown for Good framework, which is in support of our sourcing community farmers. And I think there's just tremendous technical knowledge, local networks, and just libraries of best practices and emerging practices that sit and originate with development professionals, because that is, sort of the excellence that they bring to implementation of their programs that doesn't sit in private sector actors today.
Fantastic. Ben, maybe any additional thoughts?
I mean, certainly to reinforce what Kathy said, I mean, I think this project management side and the attention to detail that we require on the international development side is extremely important. There can, I think, sometimes on the international development side be a slight weakness to that, which is an overemphasis on the detail and overemphasis on the process, and an underemphasis potentially on the outcome. And I think that's one area coming into it's really answering the previous question, but coming into the private sector, the willingness to experiment, the willingness. I mean, it's a cliche, but to take risks and see if something works, I think that's something from which the development sphere could definitely learn. I think. I mean, there's a learning process in both directions. I think another thing. I mean, I was more on the diplomatic side. I think one of the two things I think that I hope I bring from that background into the company is two things. One is, if you're working on conflict, is the necessity to see a very big picture. If you're working on a conflict in say Kosovo, as I did, or any other conflicts in East Africa, it's what are the positions of neighboring countries? Where does the US fit in this? Where does the EU fit in this? I mean, that requirement to see all sides to a problem, I think, is something that the development world, the diplomatic world, are very good at. And it's sometimes, I think, on the private sector side, this sense of directive purpose potentially leads to missing those bigger pictures. I think the second element is a facet of that, which is also that just as I think on the government side, we sometimes misunderstand business, using we in the past tense. I think similarly on the business side, there's sometimes a misunderstanding of the ways in which government works. And I think bringing people in who have worked in government, worked on the diplomatic side, it helps companies understand the ways in which the ways in which decisions are made, which is not necessarily the ways in which people think decisions are made. And I think that's something that we can bring from government into business.
Jennifer, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just add the international and global experience of living cross-culturally and languages and all of that, I think is something great. And I actually had two colleagues recently, one from Corteva, go the opposite direction. So one joined USAID and one joined Gates Foundation. And I think the idea of that kind of cross-pollination is really awesome, because the more that there can be different shared experiences and I don't know, it sounds kind of weird to say, but translators in each organization, I think the better off that everyone is. And one thing I did also want to highlight is the perception that perhaps we are the ones within the organization who are the North Star and, kind of holding the moral high ground, working within the ESG space. And I've actually found at Corteva that there are days where I can't tell the difference between working at USAID and Corteva. There is so much passion and commitment within Corteva to impact global food security, to improve lives, to empower farmers. And I think maybe it's the industry itself. Most people who get into agriculture do it because they want to make a difference in the world. But it's been really a very nice thing to discover at Corteva that North Star is really across the company, and that commitment and passion is just as strong as the colleagues that I had at USAID or DAI or state who are committed to those same global goals. So
that's fantastic. I see we're getting a few more questions coming in, so I'm going to wrap up with two final questions, and then we'll start pulling from the Q&A. So again, for the folks on the line, please do drop questions you have, as that will be our source. So one question again that I think is interesting, and maybe is probably very something that the participants on the line have in mind, is many of them either work with USAID or implementers of USAID programs. I'm curious how you think about when to partner around your ESG or international development programs versus when to go at it on your own. Maybe Kathy, we'll start with you, and then we can kind of give others a moment to present their thoughts.
Sure, and I think we maybe touched upon this a little bit in the conversation as well about bringing multiple voices to the table and the different skill sets that are needed to have that long-lasting change. I think we recognize that we have to collaborate with multiple stakeholders and leverage their experience and expertise to achieve our goals. We know that we're on a journey. We often partner with non-governmental organizations when it comes to technical skills around assessments, training, infrastructure development, and project management assistance, which we already talked about in our origin countries for our raw materials. We partner with some of the larger global entities that you might be familiar with. And then we also partner with donor and governmental organizations. I think the relationships that we have with governments and NGOs, as well as other partners, are vital to our ongoing success. And it actually allows us to drive greater impact. It can take more time, but it's just not possible to be as ambitious with our goals if we go it alone. And I think, our chief sustainability officer often says, if we succeed but others don't, then none of us have succeeded. And so I like to think about that a lot when we're trying to identify who can come to the table towards achieving our overall goals.
Ben, any thoughts?
I mean, this is a harder question for me to answer, simply because it's more in the field of others. I mean,
sure.
I think one thing I would say though is that, for instance, on a couple of the specific programs I mentioned, so for instance, the Airband initiative, this is something we only do in partnership. We have local partners in various different countries who are the local internet service providers. We provide a technical assistance to them to extend their network into more remote areas. And we work with donors to deliver that. So, for instance, Mawingu has been partnered with several different international development actors, including USAID, I think on more than one occasion, actually. But it's a local partner, and it's a local company. So again, coming back to this point that you're looking also to nurture the local digital ecosystem. And Mawingu or Mkopa or these various different companies that we worked at, Bluetown in Ghana, these are all parts of that ecosystem, and we partner with them, but we also partner with international development organizations. So Airband is something that is entirely dependent on partnerships.
Great. Jennifer, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would say for us, it's, we are continually exploring new collaboration opportunities on a, daily, weekly basis around the globe. And really, it's about where the stars align, where the crop focus aligns. We have a country focus of about 10 countries where we're most interested, where we have a strong presence on the ground, where we can really be able to have leadership and engagement in partnerships, and where even within a country, the geography, if certain regions where we may or may not have market presence. So we are always excited to be involved from the get-go. So from the bid process, from as implementing partners are looking at bidding on new programs. My colleagues are really incredibly well, have strong technical skills around agriculture in countries around the world, and have a lot of value to add during the design process. I have a lot of perspective to share on the markets and on other things related to agriculture within countries around the globe. So we're always excited when partners approach us and want to include us in some of those early discussions, want to include us as a partner on their bid, and then moving forward from that, when the projects are awarded, it makes that process so much smoother. But even for ongoing projects, we're always willing to have the conversation and explore whether the stars align.
All right. Well, my last question actually overlaps with one from the chat. So why don't we kind of transition to some of these questions? So Carrie's question touches on the topic of localization, which is certainly, of the moment. Honestly, it's been of the moment for the last 10 years. But as multinational corporations, maybe how do you fit into the localization conversation? Maybe start with Kathy, and then if others have a comment.
Thanks. Yeah. So, we're sourcing our raw materials globally, over 15,000 materials from around 80 countries. So our approach to the way we sustainably source that isn't, necessarily local. That doesn't mean that we don't also partner with global partners. But I think this is actually a space where USAID or other international development actors that have a lot of institutional knowledge as well as local network connections can be very helpful in helping identify where the promising partners might be if we don't have our boots on the ground, so to speak, in those specific countries. And so I think this is actually a point for collaboration in helping to become more localized, in addition to partnering with our global partners.
Great. Jennifer, any thoughts?
We chatted about this previously, Mike, that, I feel pretty happy that our colleagues around the globe. So for example, in Tanzania, where I showed the video, all of my colleagues in Tanzania are from Tanzania. In fact, Charles, who you saw in the video, was from Mbeya in the south, that community where he was providing agronomic support to farmers and collaborating with USAID and ACD-IVOCA in order to improve food security in his own community. So I think it's really exciting that we are a global company, but within countries, very local. We often produce seeds locally. We, work locally to develop supply chains and collaborate with the government locally. So to me, local, it means maybe something a little bit different than how USAID is defining it. But I think for me, it's equally as valuable how we are showing up locally.
No, I think it's an interesting point. In some ways, the private sector, maybe is most local in the markets that we're operating in. It's not kind of something to achieve. It's the way that we operate. So, the first question in the Q&A is, how can traditional donors like USAID better amplify, support, or collaborate on companies' ESG efforts? Not sure if any of the panelists maybe have a perspective they'd like to provide on that.
I can jump in. So, Mike, I really appreciated what you said earlier about not thinking just transactionally in terms of what a partnership might entail. And so I would say for donors like USAID, maybe be more nimble about the ways that we can collaborate, amplify, or support some of the ESG efforts. And I'll offer two recent examples. I'll leave out some of the specifics, but there was a case where we were looking to do some work in our supply chain, as we were just talking about, at a local level where we didn't necessarily previously have strong connections or good technical expertise. And so, I reached out to our POC at the USAID's regional bureau, who quickly connected us with the USAID mission and embassy. And we just had a really great conversation about what the stakeholder landscape looks like on the ground. That was super useful to kind of get our bearings in terms of what our criteria might be when we're looking for a partner, some watch outs, things like that. And I found that to be a very valuable collaboration. And in that case, maybe it was a one-off, but I think it will build the relationship as we continue to grow our supply chain in that specific area. And then in another example, I've been really excited about some of the stuff that USAID is putting out around PSE Modernized. And I think that there might be some discrete opportunities around what they're doing there. And what I appreciated from another USAID colleague is just coming to the table already having done their homework in terms of what McCormick's priorities are. And so when we were thinking about that Venn diagram of the overlap, she already had some ideas of where the overlapping space was, but we were able to have a conversation that expanded that overlapping space. And it's introductory, but I think there could be something interesting that we work on together there. So just broadly being nimble and broader in bringing what USAID has to the table.
And that's how you came off mute.
Yes, just to follow up on that, and I absolutely agree with Kathy on those points. Definitely, I think to add to that slightly, I would add it's also a question of being imaginative. For a company like Microsoft, for instance, we have these very ambitious ESG goals across the board. If USAID, for instance, is working on projects on renewable energy in Ethiopia, to give an example of stuff that I know USAID does do, perhaps there's help that Microsoft can provide from the global data that it's gathering on renewable energy across the world. So, I mean, it's also potentially accessing this open data that we have and using that as part of the project management cycle to save on costs for gaining access to that data in some other way. I think another thing is that USAID is ahead of the curve in many respects in its relationship with the private sector. Spreading the word that this is something that is helpful to other development actors would also be great. As I say, I mean, I'm coming from a European Union perspective, talking to DG INTPA, talking to DG NEAR about partnerships, the successful partnerships that USAID has had with Microsoft or McCormick or Corteva in other countries, might encourage those European actors or to be more open to partnerships with private companies in their development spending. And this is not about accessing money. It's about ensuring that we multiply the effect of good partnerships and make sure that we deliver social benefits in these countries.
I was thinking about what Kathy said, her two great examples, and you know, how it really does take a village, that we work closely with USAID in Washington, we work with USAID at the missions, but then we also work really closely with implementing partners who are out in the field doing the program. So, you know, we try to advance those relationships that you referenced earlier, Mike, for the long-term growth of those relationships, and I feel like we've been able to build a really strong foundation. We have many active partnerships around the globe, currently with USAID, and ones that were recently wrapped up, and with implementing partners as well. I think one suggestion, though, that I have is in country, I think often the embassy is still seen as a bit of a fortress and with USAID and state behind those walls. I know when I went to Zambia and Tanzania a few years ago, my colleagues had never visited the embassy, not once. And, you know, we're one of the largest US companies in those countries, and certainly the largest US agriculture company. So I think that outreach at the local level is really critical. And I know sometimes that's kind of seen as, oh, maybe the role of commerce or polycon on the state side, but definitely, you know, I would encourage all USAID folks to, whether they're abroad or in touch with people who are abroad, to do that outreach and just grab a cup of coffee and learn more about what is the footprint of Corteva in Tanzania or Myanmar, or, you know, name the country, and how, you know, let's sit down and think through what else can we be doing together. And, you know, not just projects, but on the thought leadership side, on the policy and advocacy side, on improving the regulatory environment and the, you know, science-based policy environment is really critical to our business in particular in countries where USAID operates around the globe.
Great. On to the next question. Gabriel had asked a question about the critical development needs associated with the technical vocational sector in countries and what has been effective in co-creating skills development programs. So maybe Kathy, I see that this is one that you wanted to take a crack at.
Yeah, so one thing I've been thinking about a lot is, you know, many forward-leaning companies on sustainability have set net zero ambitions around climate change that are aligned with a 1.5C warming scenario. I think it is sort of a table stakes commitment that companies need to be taking. But in order to deliver on that climate change goal, we need to obviously measure our carbon footprint. And, you know, Ben and I have both mentioned that most of our carbon footprint is in scope 3, which means outside of our facility walls and in our supply chain. For McCormick, it's about 96% of our carbon footprint sits in our supply chains. And what I've been thinking about a lot is, as we try to tackle those reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in our supply chain and measure and report on those, we're going to need a lot of expertise that's on the ground in our global portfolio that I don't think exists today. And one worry that I have for all of us, all companies that are trying to do this, is that we're actually going to be, you know, flying consultants from the United States to go and help us understand our carbon footprint, measure and report on that carbon footprint, as well as reduce the greenhouse gas emissions around that footprint. Because I think globally, we're still building that technical skill set on how you actually do that. And I just think it's a major opportunity to have on the ground skill building on those technical skills, the analytical skills around carbon accounting and ESG reporting. And I say this to anyone who will listen, because I think it's coming fast and I think it's coming soon.
I'm going to jump in right there, if I may, Mike, because indeed this sustainability skills gap is a huge issue. Having people who are able to monitor, report on, and measure sustainability commitments of companies, of governments, it's a big issue. In fact, I'm posting a lot of stuff in the chat, but there's another report that we produced here on sustainability skills gaps. Now, it doesn't directly answer the question that was asked about Gabriel, but this issue of skilling, it's huge. Now, the level of skilling training required will of course vary hugely according to the project, according to the country, according to the part of that country. I think one of the moving things in the video I mentioned about Kakuma refugee camp is the fact that the skilling program for digital skills in that refugee camp begins with how to turn a computer on. Of course it does, because many of the people there will never have seen one. But then, of course, when you go to the cyber skilling element, you go to the sustainability skilling element, you're now talking about university educated people. But developing those skills in the countries where they need to be applied is vital to avoid exactly the problem that Kathy was talking about, that you don't have to fly somebody from Seattle, in our case, to talk about what our emissions are in Australia. So yeah, this is going to be a huge issue. Whether we're getting it right or not, I'm not in a position to answer, but all I can do is guide you to the various different reportings that we've done on this, and to make the point that certainly as a company, I can say we take this very seriously. We produce reports on cybersecurity skilling, we produce reports on sustainability skilling. So yeah, it's a huge issue, and we have to get it right.
Fantastic. So I see there's a question from Salamata, and this one I guess is to Kathy. I'll let you determine if it's something you feel like you can answer. With respect to using the materiality assessment to prioritize interventions, have there been instances where you could not address identified needs and leveraged USAID or other donor fundings to support? I'm not sure if that.
Yeah, sure, I can touch on that. I guess I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't see it as instances where we couldn't identify or address the identified needs. I see it more as how can we best address the identified needs, and often that's through collaboration. And we have had collaborations with USAID. We have some global development alliances around sustainable sourcing. We partner with others on that effort as well. And I think the learnings are some of the ones that we've shared here today. Is just I think the main one is building that continued shared understanding in order to grow the relationship and be able to identify where future opportunities might be. I know we're short on time, so I'll just keep it at that.
All right. Why don't we try to do one more question, and then we can wrap up. I see there's a question in the chat from Todd Kirkbride. Nice to see you, Todd. Do you feel that any of the 3 ESG areas are dominating or influencing the others, or might the ESGs be misdirecting any of the real social impact versus gathering metrics and box checking? Not sure if that rings a bell with any of the panelists.
I think that the E of ESG is maybe better established in terms of what we mean by having environmental impact and measuring that impact. But I think there's a growing demand for the S. And we see that in our materiality assessment, actually. And so I think that was something surprising to us, is the areas where we felt we had quite strong programming fell lower on a materiality. And our understanding was that it's because it's almost as though those are more well understood. And so we need to better build our understanding in the S. But the social issues are in high demand right now.
Ben or Jennifer, any other comments on that one?
I would agree 100% with Kathy. I mean, it's a commonly observed phenomenon that the E is much more established, better measured. There are better standards for measurement than the social side of things. But I mean, what I've tried to talk about today is more on the social side in terms of the impact that we're trying to drive it through airband or TSI in less developed countries. And so, this is, as I said before, it's part of our corporate social responsibility commitments, but it's also a business endeavor.
All right. Well, we are at 10:59. So with that, I want to thank each of our panelists, Jennifer, Ben, and Kathy, for your time today and your time in preparing for this conversation. Thanks so much. I'd like to also thank Sid, Malavika, for helping us have a platform for this conversation. And additionally, I'd like to thank all of the participants for their interest in sticking with us for this early morning conversation. So thanks to everybody. And with that, I'd just like to say have a nice day. And for anybody who's interested in the event, as Malavika indicated, it will be recorded and you can access from SID's website. Bye, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.